I have been interested in modular synth for quite some time now, but I never took the leap to start building my modular system. So that may be a good way to start experimenting with it. The Volca Modular is kind of divided in two parts, with the modular section at the top here and the sequence section at the bottom there. So I propose we'll see all the modular section first, and then we'll see all we can do with this sequencer. There's a lot to be said, so you'll find all the timings for the different parts of this review/tutorial in the description. So what's a modular synth to begin with? A modular synth, like the name states, is a synth made of different modules, and each of these modules have a particular role. It can be an oscillator, which will be the sound source, it can be a filter, an LFO, an envelope generator, or different effects like reverb, delay, saturation, etc. There are several formats for modular synth, but the principles stay the same. Most of the time these modules are designed to do pretty much one thing, and the magic is that you can connect them in the order and in the way you want. So for example, you could use the LFO to control the volume or amplitude of the oscillator. Or you can use it to control its pitch. Or you could send the oscillator to a filter and use the LFO to control the cutoff of that filter. We're only scratching the surface here, but what you need to remember is that it gives you a lot of freedom in the way each part of the synth interacts with the others. So what modules do we have on the Volca Modular? So it has a source module, which is actually two oscillators, like two VCOs with triangle wave shapes. So we can detune the second oscillator compared to the first one with this ratio knob. It can go from a ratio of 1 to 4, which makes the second oscillators 2 octaves lower than the first one, to a ratio of 4 to 1, which makes the second oscillator 2 octaves higher than the first one. If you want to detune the first oscillator, the main one, you can do that as well by maintaining the function button and turning the ratio knob. Then you can do FM synthesis by telling how much you want the second oscillator to modulate the first one with this mod knob. And you can do some wave folding with the fold knob, which is a type of distortion that folds the waveform back onto itself. So of course you can combine the two. So you can use both the fold and the mod knobs to add harmonics to the sound and create more abrasive sounds. Then you have two envelope generators, one that allows you to adjust the attack time and the release time, and one that have a shape knob that allows you to go from short attack, long release to long attack, short release, and a time knob that defines the overall length of this attack release cycle. Then you have two low-pass gates, which are like a combination of a low-pass filter and a volume knob, like a VCA. And the cutoff knobs there control both the cutoff of the filter and the amplitude, the volume of the signal. Which means the more you turn this knob down, the more filtered the sound, but also the more quiet the sound. And this last one is a reverb that sounds like a spring reverb. And the black knob here at the end is the master volume for the whole synth. So now around that you have several utility sections that will be useful to design your own patches. You have the clock section, which allows you to trigger several things in time with the tempo of the track. Then you have a Woggle section, which is like a sample and hold, so it's good to implement some randomness in your patch. Next to that you have a split section, which allows you to send one signal to two different locations. And there are actually two splits in there, so one per line, so you can divide two signals to two channels each. And one thing to note is that you can also use this module in reverse to mix two signals together. And next to that you have the CV section, which allows you to control different parts of the synth with another modular system, which is nice if you already have a modular synth, so the two can communicate together and interact with each other. And finally, below the low-pass gates you have a utility sections to mix signals together. So you put them in the A and the B inputs, and then you can either add them or subtract them by using either the A plus B B or the A minus B output. And then you have this knob, which is C, which acts like an attenuator to make the signal more or less powerful. We'll see how to use it in a second, because the next question is, how do we actually connect all that to create our own patches? So you can connect them by using these cables that come with the Volca Modular. It's actually the same kind you can get to use with a breadboard to prototype electronic circuits. So if you feel that these get easily lost, good news is that it's really easy to find replacements. And so you can plug them in those little holes that you have at the front of the Volca Modular. The white one are the inputs to bring signal in, and each one have a little icon or a little line to show you what it connects to. And the black ones are the outputs to take the signal out. And there are actually two kinds of signals you can use, like in any modular setups. There are the audio signals, which is the actual audio. The audio ins and outs are the ones with a little circle in the corners. And there are CV signals, which are basically informations to control some other parameters. Like the signal that would go from the clock section to an envelope to tell it when it's triggered. The CVs in and out are the squared ones. Some of these connections between the modules are actually already made inside the Volca Modular, so you could begin to use it without patching any cable. You can see these internal connections with the faint lines on the front panel. So the first oscillator is already connected to the first low-pass gate, which is being triggered by the first envelope. Itself being triggered by the gate up there. And then all that finally goes to the reverb. So right off the bat you can play with the oscillator setting with the first envelope, the first filter and the reverb to alter the sound. Okay, so now let's try to make example patches. I will try to make an example with each of these modules so you can see how to use each of them. So in the source module, you can send in signals to control the pitch, the ratio, the fold, and the pitch modulation. And you can take the output of both oscillators with the output 1 and 2. Output 1 is the oscillator used as a modulator for this FM knob, and the output 2 is the main oscillator that we hear by default. So if you want to hear the second oscillator, you could take its output, which is the first black hole here, and send it by, for example, to the second low-pass gate. So on this low-pass gate, the first input is the sound you want to filter, and the second one is to control this cutoff parameter. So for now, if I close the first low-pass gate, we can't hear anything because there is nothing to trigger the second low-pass gate to let the second oscillator through. Let's use the second envelope generator for that. So we can take the positive output of the second envelope generator and set it to the low-pass gate, just like it is done with the first envelope and the first LPG. And now to hear it, the envelope needs to be triggered as well. So we can take the gate up here from the clock section and send it to the second envelope input. You can see this input is waiting for a trigger type of signal with this little impulse icon. So every time a note is played, the clock sends a gate signal, which launches the rise and fall cycle of the second envelope, which will open and close the low-pass gate. If I cut the first low-pass gate, I cut the first oscillator, so we hear only the second one. And if I cut the second one and open the first one, it will be the other way around, so we will hear only the first oscillator. The clock module basically sends an information every time a note is played in the sequence. On the last output, it sends the pitch information of each note. Then the output next to that is the gate, so the clock sends an impulse every time a note is played, and that's what we use to trigger the envelope. And then on the /2, /3, and /4 outputs, the clock sends a gate every 2, every 3, and every 4 notes played respectively. So if you take the /4 output to trigger the second envelope, for example, you could have a bass note every 4 notes. Or you could do some kind of polyrhythm if you play, for example, every 2 notes on one oscillator and every 3 notes on the other one. So there is no LFO module on the Volca Modular, but you can still create one with the envelope generator. See, on these envelope generators, you have a positive output, an inverted output, and a trigger output. The trigger actually sends an impulse at the end of every envelope cycle. So you could send this trigger back into the envelope's input, so every time a cycle ends, it triggers another one. And then to control the LFO, you still have the shape knob to control the shape of the LFO, and the time knob to control the rate, the speed of the LFO. So let's get rid of this second oscillator circuit. So we could use this LFO to control anything, like let's say the amount of the reverb or the fold or the mod. Now you could use this utility section to mix two signals together by putting them into the inputs A and B. You can add them or subtract B from A by choosing either the A plus B or the A minus B output. And then the knob C defines how much of B goes into the mix. So we could create a vibrato with that. The goal would be to mix the pitch sent by the sequencer with the LFO we just created and use that to control the pitch of the oscillator. So to do that, we can take the pitch from the clock section and send it to the input of the utility. And then we can take the output of our LFO and we can send that to the input B of the utility. And then we'll take the sum of the two to send it to the pitch input of the oscillator. Then we have this utility knob to tell how strong we want that vibrato to be, and we have this time knob to set the speed of the vibrato. So the split module now can split a signal into two channels to send it to two different destinations. So for example, let's send the second oscillator to the second LPG again. Now we could use the split module to control both LPGs with only one envelope. To do so, we can send the positive output of the first envelope generator to the split and then take the two outputs of the split to send one in each LPG. So this way envelope 1 triggers both LPGs. You could also use the split module the other way around to mix two signals together. So to control the two oscillators with only one envelope, you could send the two outputs of the two oscillators to the split and then take the unique output and send that to the LPG. Then the two oscillators would go through the same LPG, which is controlled by the first envelope. The downside of doing it that way is that in that way you will have only one LPG to control both oscillators, so you can't control the volume of both oscillators individually. Now the Woggle module is a sample and hold, which is good to add randomness in your patch. It takes a signal and a gate as an input, and basically it follows the input signal, and every time it receives a trigger, a gate, it logs the value it's at and holds it until it receives another trigger. Then on the output side there is a squared output which gives the values directly as it holds them, and a rounded output which glides between each value. By default, if no source is connected, it takes the white noise as an input, which is basically random. And if no gate is connected, by default it will take this gate from the clock, so the value will change with every note of the sequence. So to hear the effect of the Woggle, let's plug its squared output to the pitch of the oscillator. So you can hear the pitch changing with every step of the sequencer. Now we could take the /4 from the clock to put it into the gate input, so the value will change every 4 note of the sequencer. Now let's hear how the rounded output sounds like. So that's a lot you can do with this Volca Modular, and even more things to experiment to create your own sounds. And then once you have your sound, your patch ready, you can play all that with the sequencer. So yeah, let's see the options we have with these now. So let's start with an empty sequence. To clear the sequence I'm on, I have to press the function button with the pad 16, which says clear all. So it deletes all the data of the sequence. The function button allows you to access all the secondary functions written under each pad or button. So to record a riff step by step, you can press the function button with the record button to enter this step record mode. Then the Volca Modular enters a state where it's waiting for a note for the first step. Then it's waiting for a note for the second step. Then it's waiting for the third step, etc. So you can start writing your sequence like this. The Volca Modular can actually play notes on 3 octaves. So with the function button, you can use the pad 5 and 6 that says octave up and octave down to move the octave you're using. Here I am on the lowest octave, function octave up. Here I am on the middle octave, and now I'm on the highest octave. And if you want to insert a silence in your sequence, you can press the Rec button. It will include the silence and move forward one step. And then you can press the function button again to leave this mode. And of course you can also record some notes live by playing them. To do so, just press the Rec button while the sequence is playing and start playing. Everything you play will be added to the loop. And you can also add automations to your sequence. While the sequence is playing, if you keep the record button pressed and you turn some knobs, the motion of the knobs will be added to the sequence. And you can see these automations with the LEDs blinking inside these knobs. And it's a very nice addition because you can do a lot already with this modular setup, but it's very limited at the same time. So you can add another layer of complexity to the sound by giving it a bit of motion, which is nice. Then you can choose to activate or deactivate these automations with the motion on-off function, which is on the pad 13. So with the funk button, with the pad 13, you can turn on and off these automations. No automations. Back on. Or you could completely delete all these automations with the pad 14, which says motion clear. So funk button, motion clear. Once you have your sequence, you can do several things with it. You can transpose it to different scales, so all the notes used would be from this particular scale. To do that, press the funk button with a scale that is on the pad 1. And then you can choose from a chromatic scale, a major scale, a minor scale, a harmonic minor, melodic minor, Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian, exotic 1. There is the exotic 2, which is actually a whole tone scale, a Japanese pentatonic scale, minor pentatonic, major pentatonic, and chromatic reverse, which is interesting to kind of invert your riff. So let's choose, for example, the harmonic minor. And then you can change the tonic of the scale you're using by pressing function and tonic on pad 2. Then all the pads from 4 to 15 becomes all the notes of the chromatic scale, so C, C sharp, D, D sharp, E, etc. all the way to B. So let's select B. So this way you could use any scale like C major, C minor, D major, D minor. And the cool thing is that it changes instantly between all these scales when the loop is playing. So it's a nice feature to add some motion to your music when you're jamming live. But now what if by any chance you wanted to use a scale that is not available in the Volca Modular? Well, you could create new scales with the Microtuning Functions. It allows you to detune notes in your scale individually by up to plus or minus 100 cents. So you could move notes in the scale up or down a semitone. So to do that, you press the funky button with Microtuning Edit, which is on pad 3. And then you hold the note you want to change and change the value with a reverb knob, which says Microtune. You also have a microtuning random function to change the microtuning of all the notes randomly. To do that, it's the funky button with randomize microtuning on pad 9. And then you can do microtuning clear on pad 4 to remove all the microtuning changes. Now, when you're jamming with your sequence, there are several ways you can make variations. First, there is the active step function that allows you to deactivate some step of your sequence to make shorter loops. So to enter the active step mode, you press the funky button and active step, which is on the play button. Then you can deactivate the steps you want to skip in your sequence. And you can also use the randomize active step on pad 8 to skip random steps. And you can also change the way the sequence in itself is played. Right now it's playing from left to right in loop, so it's normal mode. But there's also a bounce mode, which will read the sequence from left to right and then right to left in a ping-pong fashion. And then there's stochastic mode, which I found very cool. Basically, we'll make a random sequence based on the notes that are already in your sequence. Every time a step is played, the next step will be chosen randomly between the step before it, the same step again, the step after it, or the step after that. So all together with the change of scale, the active state, the playback mode, that's a lot of options to generate a lot of riffs that are all related to one another. And I think it makes it easier for jamming and funnier as well. So once you have your sequence ready, you can save it by pressing the funk button with a right, which is on the memory button. Then each pad represents a different slot, so you have 16 slots to choose from. And then to load a sequence, simply press the memory button with the pad of the bank you want to load. The cool thing is that if you're loading these sequences while the Volca is playing, you won't have any gap in the sound, it will just load right away. Another cool thing as well is that you can actually select a range of several slots, so all the sequences in that range will be played in chain. So memory and chain 5 and 6. It is nice if you want to make longer loops than 16 steps, so you can save it in several parts in several slots. For example, I like the sequence I have on the slot 4 and I like the sequence I have on the slot 16. But I can't really play only those two. If I want to play only those two in chain, I would have to save them side by side on 2 slots. So that kind of wraps up all the functionalities of the Volca Modular. So what do you think about it? Let me know in the comments what you think about the Volca Modular. Let's make a list of the pros and the cons before drawing the conclusions. With such a limited space, I guess they had to choose wisely what modules they wanted to implement. But there are still a few things that I would have loved to see on it. Like, I would have loved to see the filters separated from the VCA, for instance. So we could have separate envelopes for the filter and for the amplitude. It would have been great if linking the two would have been only an option. It would have been cool as well if we could change the shape of the oscillator for a sawtooth wave or for a square wave, for example. That would have allowed for much more variety in the sound. But I have to say, this is kind of the curse of all modular systems in general. When you are so free in the way you connect all the modules together, there is always a point where you just wish you had more to play with. No matter how many modules you have, no matter how many cables you have. And it's kind of the beauty of modular, is that you can always add modules to expand your setup, which leads me to the pros. The CV-in is a nice addition, so you could use it with another modular setup. So you could use external modules to send CV-in to control some parts of this synth, and then take the result from the audio outputs and send it to other effects like delays or saturation, for example. So you could start from there to then expand your setup with other modules. That makes a good introduction to modular systems at a very fair price. Another pro for me is the sequencer, which is very fun to use. You can easily come up with something cool, especially with the randomize and the scales functions. And then you have several options to make variations on this sequence you just made. I like the tiny size as well. I know some people might not like it as the knobs can feel a bit tiny in the hand, but the little size makes it really easy to transport. It fits in any bag, it's easy to have close to you in your home studio for when you need it, and you can even go play in the park if you want, as it accepts batteries and you have small speakers on it as well. Speaking of battery, you can use a power supplies, which is way more convenient, but it is sold separately, so you have to know that. To summarize, I think it's a pretty neat machine to experiment with modular at a low price. It has a limited amount of modules, but you can still do nice things with it. If you are looking for a first modular synth to experiment, I think it could be good, and the sequencer makes it definitely fun to play with. I hope this video has been useful for you to know exactly what this thing does and how to use it. Like, subscribe, share this video with your friends. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you next time.